Alright, I guess I'll do 64 DS. Years after 64 changed the scope of gaming, 64 DS completely shifted everyone's view of handheld games. Or at least we thought it did. But I feel like all the big hitters still treated the DS like it was just the Game Boy Advance advanced. Still, the hype for 64 DS was very much there. Longtime viewers of this channel remember that I grew up playing the classic Mario games on console, but around the time I turned 11 the GBA came out, and that's when I was able to put exponentially more hours into those games just due to the logistics of no longer having to be tied to a TV that was shared by the entire family. The GBA for me was my portable SNES. I ended up loving the SNES more because of the GBA, so when the DS was announced, with Mario 64 x 4, I completely lost it. I couldn't believe I'd have a portable Nintendo 64 with me everywhere I went. Obviously, the reality didn't live up to the expectation, but I still loved my original chunky DS, even if it didn't have a joystick. Great segue, I know. Let's get straight into the controls of Mario 64 DS, since that's the most controversial aspect of this game, and realistically speaking, anyone that clicked on this video is looking for that point of discussion. Now, if I was making this video a decade ago, maybe even half a decade ago, the focus of my thesis would be geared towards OG 64 fans about why I think the DS controls are acceptable and how I can prove it. Think along the lines of EXO's remake or rebreak video. But today it's a very different discussion. People no longer think OG 64's controls were a gift from above to all that should be blessed enough to play a perfect 3D platformer. Today's point of view is not even remotely that. I had to spend a bunch of time defending the controls of the original explicitly because of the discourse on it has shifted more than I could ever have imagined. And most people can't see past the controls as anything but outdated. My argument thus has shifted. And, if I can be completely honest, I don't really care that much to discuss the controls. Or rather, I don't care to make an in-depth head-to-head argument between the controls. It's been done to death, and I imagine people that say the DS destroyed the controls of Mario 64 are never going to have their opinions changed. And folks that think the DS controls were good enough will carry that sentiment regardless of what I say. Neither of them is literally unplayable, and both can be easily adapted to as far as I'm concerned. For me, I like both. And no, that's not a cop-out. I played Mario 64 a ton. I revisited on 64 proper throughout the years, grabbed it on every virtual console it was released on, and now 3D All-Stars is my go-to Mario 64 experience. But, until it was on 3D All-Stars, despite the renewed playthroughs and virtual consoles, the DS version was what I primarily returned to strictly because of that portability. DS was basically my preferred Mario 64 experience, strictly for that reason. I never viewed the controls as an issue for either title, because regardless of which version I played, within like 10 minutes, muscle memory would kick in and I'd have adjusted. And within 20 to 30 minutes, I was trying all of the same risky maneuvers. The sad reality is that both control schemes kinda stink if you're viewing them from the lens of a modern gamer. And much like all retro games, will require an adjustment. Basically, if you take all of the arguments about learning to control Mario, the camera, the jank, and the finickiness that I discussed in the previous videos, you could easily apply them here. I think 64 DS's control can be adapted to, whether you're playing it on a Wii U or 3DS using a joystick or with a D-pad on original hardware. My personal preferred method is probably 3DS because it's handheld and you get the joystick, which I know doesn't make the controls analog, but it feels better on my thumb. But ultimately, that's a preference thing, and from a personal perspective, since this is my subjective retrospective, I view the controls of both games as a tie. I'm not nearly advanced enough in either game to claim one control significantly better than the other, and as someone that has basically played both of these games almost yearly, I'd wager that there's only a select chunk of OG 64 and DS experts that are so good at either of these games and are playing at such a high level that the control differences actually affects their games that much. Basically, unless you're like a top 10 speedrunner or someone that puts hundreds of hours into these games every year, I find it very hard to understand why you'd be incapable of easily adjusting between control styles for even an above average control experience, let alone a casual one. So if it's all the same to you guys, I'd much rather focus on more intricate details of the game and maybe bring in some new talking points instead of regurgitating what has already been done to death. Also, I like playing it handheld because it looks much better than when it's stretched out to fit a screen on the Wii U. And I realize there are various mods and texture packs that can fix those things, but that's a separate discussion. As far as visuals go, once upon a time I'd have told you the DS was clearly the superior version. Now it's a bit more up in the air. The DS character models are more in line with the modern designs though, since many of them take inspiration from the GameCube era. And I'm not even talking about the obvious ones like Mario, Bowser, or even Thwomp. Even the plain old circular boos look more in line with today's models because their design in DS was based on Mario Party 4. That's the benefit of this game coming out a few years after the GameCube's release. On the other hand, the models in the OG game weren't even the best ones on the Nintendo 64 since there were spin-offs that had improved their looks. Maybe I shouldn't use the word best because there are probably viewers that think that Mario 64 models are better than modern day ones. But what I mean is that there is a world where a Mario 64 could have models that look similar to today's using the native 64 designs from spin-off games. Whether or not someone would consider that better is completely subjective. I personally would. Sure, there are certain things I prefer in 64. For example, I prefer the original look of Dory. But me preferring that look does not make it better. And I'll apply that logic for basically all of the models. Even if you prefer the Bowser that looks like he got stung by a bee, the DS version is more updated and true to the character version of Bowser's model. Same with Mario, Klepto, and even the Angry Cloud. And I don't think it's that controversial for me to make that claim. What is something a bit more controversial are the remaining visuals in the title. Upon release, you couldn't convince me that any aspect of DS looked worse than the 64. But I'm currently of the opinion that 64's look has aged better. I'm not sure if this makes sense, but the art style of DS has been improved upon in future Mario games. But the low poly look pretty much peaked with 64 as far as 3D Mario platformers go. And I'm not technical enough to really explain it in detail, but when I look at the visuals of DS, all I can picture is how much better and more crisp they would look with a modern touch. Whereas when I play Mario 64, I'm just like, yep, that's what a Nintendo 64 game looks like. I think this is a similar point of view that people have when they discuss Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. Twilight Princess was seen as this amazing looking 3D title that took Zelda to the next generation, while Wind Waker was seen as an old and outdated art style. But because everything that has been done in Twilight Princess has since been improved upon, and Wind Waker is close enough to the peak of that art style at the moment, when modern gamers put them side to side, they would lean towards Wind Waker being the better looking game. At least, I'm pretty sure that's the common point of view, and I'm really only talking about the Zelda games this much because most of you have hopefully already heard this discussion and are able to use that logic to understand why I think the art style and visuals in general look better to me in the Nintendo 64 version of Mario than they do in DS. But at the end of the day, both of these look old and outdated and charming to me. I'm not playing either of them thinking they're hideous, I'm playing them and enjoying the nostalgia trip. But still, I'd say visuals and controls are the biggest things a player notices when jumping into Mario 64 DS. Well, that and the character roster. Just like Smash Ultimate, everyone's here except for Waluigi. The game starts you off with Yoshi, and you have to unlock the Mario Bros. And Wario. I've always viewed this as a feature rather than a bug, but others have seemed to have issues with it. I don't know, I can't imagine I'll convince you otherwise, so I won't bother trying. I thought not only was the inclusion of multiple characters very cool, but the fact that the game starts you off with Yoshi sleeping on top of the castle almost made me feel like this was a sequel adventure. Or at least made it seem like this game could actually exist in an alternate parallel timeline where Luigi and Wario ran into the castle with Mario. There was a sense of cohesion because of this, and it was a nice callback to the original, specifically one of the highlight moments of the original. Either way, there's a whole dynamic with the caps that I'm assuming most of you already are aware of, but Mario does all the flying, Luigi does the invisible stuff, Wario does the metal stuff, and Yoshi does the Yoshi stuff. You can get through most of this game by sticking with Mario if you'd like, or if you prefer to experiment, you can stick with Yoshi but be limited without certain moves like Mario's wall kick. Luigi is definitely the Funky Kong mode here. His backflip actually breaks most platforming challenges in the game. Keep that in mind for later. I'd say Wario is probably the hard mode due to his limited mobility and the lack of necessity for his strength power-up minus the few context-sensitive moments a player will need him to break down a block. Personally, I think Wario, despite being my favorite character in the Marioverse, is boring to control. Mario is the most fun if you're playing the game normally, Luigi is the best if you're in need of a crutch, or you'd like to experiment. Yoshi is not as unenjoyable as Wario, but I don't think his minor benefits like egg throws is enough to justify using him over the two bros. Basically, I think the best way to approach this game is to enjoy Yoshi up until you unlock Mario, and then continue the game normally, and only use Yoshi or Wario for their required moments in the game, and Luigi anytime you're stuck and ready to quit playing because of the platforming challenge. But that's just how I approach it. Either way, as you move forward in the game and unlock more characters, it can be a bit annoying to return to the required room to change your character, but to offset this, the stages will provide caps that you can collect quickly to change into other characters if need be. And if you're using Yoshi, you can even choose to enter the stage with one of those caps on, which is probably the most underrated aspect of maining Yoshi in this game. Sure, that means you'll be hearing Yoshi's audio, but I don't think I find this as annoying as most people do. So if that's something that bothers you, then don't use Yoshi. But in general, the audio and music for the most part sounds fine for me across both games. The audio differences don't stick out to me as much as they do to others, and even if they did, while yes, I love video game music, I also am not extremely particular on the audio side of things, so it's hard for me to really scrutinize things to the extent that many other people will. But anyway, I've covered the controls, the visuals, the characters, and the game mechanics, and somewhat glossed over the audio. These are generally the main topics. An hour-long review of 64DS will usually spend 45 minutes talking about at least 2 or 3 out of the 4 things I just mentioned. Quite frankly, I find the discussion mundane, repetitive, overly subjective, and all-around boring. I address these talking points because I know if I don't, everyone would be like, how are you going to discuss 64DS without mentioning the controls and visuals and characters and audio? So now that we have those things out of the way, let's move on to the juicy stuff. After teetering back and forth between multiple ideas throughout the fall, I decided I'd do daily Mario 64 videos through the month of December. I told myself I'd hit every day from December 1st until the 24th. Well, I missed the first week, but I achieved that goal from the 7th and onwards. I don't know if it's a December bump, a Mario 64 bump, a video quality bump, or a YouTube algorithm bump, but what I do realize is I have a whole lot of momentum right now and I'd be foolish to stop. That, and I could literally talk about Mario games for 10 to 15 minutes a day for an entire year if I really wanted to. So this video isn't a one-off 64DS retrospective. It's the start of my next series. Or maybe a continuation of the previous one depending on how you look at it. I'm going to move stage by stage like I did for OG 64, highlighting some of the more obvious yet intricate differences in regards to the stage layout and objectives. A big reason why I discuss the controls and visuals here is because I don't want to waste a whole ton of time discussing those things as I run through the stages. I'd much rather focus on 4 primary things. Number 1. The added star in each stage and an analysis of whether that star feels like a worthy addition or pointless fluff. Number 2. Any changes to the stars through each stage and whether those changes were for the better, worse, or negligible. Number 3. Any significant stage alterations and how they can affect the gameplay of the stage, as well as any added impact they have to any of the stars in the stage. Number 4. Whether or not the inclusion of the map on the second screen helps or hinders the experience. Like if it makes a star too easy, I'll dock the DS version a point, and if it makes an overly obscure star more feasible to grab, I'll give the DS version a point. I'm going to try and limit the map discussion though, and save it for only the extreme cases because I think there are a lot of stars that are helped by the map, but they weren't so hard to find in the original game that the inclusion of the map made all that much of a difference. Also, I don't really want to have a map displayed on the screen through these videos, so it's easier that way. Keep in mind there will be changes that I don't view as relevant enough to mention, like the behavior of an enemy or a brick block along your path, or anything that I don't deem as significant enough to alter the total experience. At the end of each segment, I'll analyze if the above inclusions or alterations are enough for me to claim a stage is definitively better on the DS, or if they're more or less pointless add-ons and don't do enough to improve the experience and maybe even make it worse. And I'll tie it all up at the end to determine whether or not the DS is the, or at least my, definitive experience of Mario 64. However, there have to be assumptions made that the controls, audio, visuals, change of characters, and even inclusions of the map are on equal grounds. Someone that absolutely can't enjoy the DS version without a joystick won't agree with me. And likewise, someone that hates the way the Nintendo 64 version looks and can't play without a map, or anyone that prefers having only Mario go for a metal cap or multiple characters unique to each power-up and etc., those people probably won't be able to agree with me. So the only way I can comfortably tackle this is to assume these changes are negligible differences across titles, or at the very least too subjective to analyze with an objective lens. And as an added bonus, since it tends to be a major talking point and I'd like to take on some kind of controversial challenge, I want to analyze how many stars in this game are legitimately broken by Luigi, specifically because of his backflip. This Luigi tally won't affect the above discussion on which version I view as definitive, rather it's a separate talking point to gather empirical data to determine if the Luigi backflip actually breaks the game, or if it's just another easy statement to make anytime someone discusses the 2 versions of this title so they can shrug off the DS game as broken because of Luigi. I plan on starting with Bob-omb Battlefield this time, and the hub world and its changes will be discussed when I do the secret stars at the end. I don't imagine each course will get its own video, but with the amount of fluff included in every one of my videos, I can't promise anything. But for now, let's once again head over to Bob-omb Battlefield.